Picture this, an unstoppable army, battle-hardened and relentless, brought to its knees not by enemy swords, but by something far more unpredictable, the sky itself. History loves to glorify the genius of generals and the might of armies, but what if the true game changer in some of the medieval world's most pivotal campaigns wasn't human at all? Think of the frozen rivers that transformed into icy highways, allowing invaders to march where no one expected them, or the droughts that turned fertile lands into wastelands, leaving once proud armies starving and scattered. Climate didn't just influence history, it rewrote it, bending the fate of empires to its will. This is the untold story of how nature's fury and favor shaped the medieval world in ways you've likely never considered. We're not talking about minor setbacks or inconvenient rain showers. We're talking about moments when a single storm, a sudden frost, or a prolonged drought tipped the scales of power forever. Imagine a castle that could have held out for months, crumbling because a harsh winter froze its water supply, or a naval fleet poised for victory, scattered and sunk by an unexpected tempest. These weren't just twists of fate, they were turning points that decided who ruled and who fell. So why don't we hear more about these climate-driven dramas? Perhaps because history prefers to credit kings and conquerors, not the invisible hand of the elements. But today, we're pulling back the curtain on 20 of the most astonishing moments when weather and climate didn't just change the battlefield, they changed the world. From the bone-chilling winters that halted entire invasions to the freak storms that saved kingdoms from certain doom, these stories will make you see medieval history in a whole new light. Get ready to explore the battles where the real MVP wasn't the general on horseback, it was the wind, the rain, and the relentless march of the seasons. The stage is set and the stakes couldn't be higher. Let's begin. The Vikings once ruled the waves with their legendary longships, carving out trade routes and settlements from the Mediterranean to the icy shores of Greenland. But even these fearless seafarers couldn't outmaneuver the greatest adversary of all, a shifting climate. As the Little Ice Age tightened its grip in the 14th century, the North Atlantic became a battleground of frost and famine. The very waters that had been highways for Viking expansion turned treacherous, choked with sea ice that made navigation nearly impossible. In Greenland, where Norse settlers had thrived for centuries, glaciers crept forward like silent invaders, swallowing pastures and cutting off supply routes to Europe. Starvation loomed as winters grew longer and crops failed year after year. Back in Scandinavia, the heartland of Viking power, the situation was just as dire. Shorter growing seasons meant less food, and weakened harvests sparked unrest among populations that had once fueled raiding parties and trade networks. The Viking Age didn't end with a single battle or a rival empire's triumph. It withered under the weight of relentless cold. By the 15th century, Greenland's settlements were ghost towns, their fate sealed not by enemy axes but by an environment that had turned against them. Even their famed adaptability couldn't save them when the land itself became inhospitable. What's truly striking is how quickly a civilization built on resilience unraveled when nature shifted the rules. The Vikings had survived harsh conditions before, but the Little Ice Age wasn't just a bad winter, it was a new reality. Their story is a stark reminder that no empire, no matter how fierce or resourceful, is immune to the whims of climate. As we piece together clues from abandoned farms and ice-bound shipwrecks, we're left with a haunting question. If the Vikings couldn't outlast the cold, what does that mean for societies facing climate challenges today? The past doesn't just whisper warnings, it shouts them. The Mongol invasion of Hungary in 1241 should have been another swift victory for history's most feared conquerors. Subutai, Genghis Khan's legendary general, had perfected the art of lightning-fast warfare, using frozen rivers as highways for his cavalry. That winter, the Danube became his secret weapon, a solid sheet of ice that let his forces charge deep into Europe with terrifying speed. Hungarian defenders, unprepared for an attack across what should have been impassable water, watched in horror as the Mongols crossed effortlessly. But then nature flipped the script. An early thaw cracked the ice beneath the hooves of the Mongol horses, turning the Danube from a strategic shortcut into a death trap. Floodwaters surged, swallowing supply carts and isolating entire divisions. The same mobility that had made the Mongols unstoppable now worked against them. Their famed horse archers found themselves bogged down in mud, their advance grinding to a halt. For the first time, the masters of maneuver warfare were outmaneuvered by the weather itself. What makes this moment so pivotal is the ripple effect of that thaw. Had the cold held just a few weeks longer, Subutai's forces might have reached Vienna, then one of Christendom's great capitals. The Mongols were already probing deeper into Europe than any Asian army before them, and a victory here could have redrawn the continent's political map. Instead, the flooded Danube forced a retreat, buying critical time for fractured European kingdoms to organize. Some historians argue this was the farthest west the Mongols would ever reach, not because of any army's strength, but because a single unpredictable spring rewrote their destiny. It's a stark lesson in how even the mightiest war machines are no match for climate's whims. The Mongols had thrived in the harsh steppes, using blizzards to mask their movements and freezing rivers to outflank enemies. But when the weather turned against them, their greatest strengths became liabilities. This wasn't just a lost battle, it was a turning point that likely spared Central Europe from becoming another Mongol province. The next time you hear about an unstoppable force, remember, sometimes all it takes is one unseasonably warm day to change everything. Imagine a kingdom where even the wealthiest nobles scrabbled in the mud for roots to eat, where armored knights traded their swords for moldy bread, and where entire armies dissolved not from enemy steel but from empty bellies. This was the nightmare Europe faced during the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, a catastrophe born not from poor strategy or weak leadership, but from skies that refused to stop weeping. For 2 relentless years, torrential rains turned fertile fields into swamps, rotting grain in the ground and drowning livestock in their pens. Rivers burst their banks, washing away roads critical for moving troops and supplies. What began as a seasonal inconvenience became a death sentence for medieval warfare's most precious resource, food. Edward II of England learned this brutal lesson firsthand as he marched north to confront Scottish rebels. His campaign should have been a show of force, but without functioning supply lines, his army became a starving mob. Desertions spread like plague. Soldiers who could barely lift their weapons had no hope of holding formations or storming castles. Meanwhile, Scottish forces led by Robert the Bruce exploited the chaos, raiding what little food remained and vanishing into rain-soaked hills. The famine didn't just weaken Edward's army, it erased the very possibility of large-scale combat. Battles weren't lost on the field, they were lost in the silent collapse of logistics, in the hollow eyes of men too weak to wield their spears. But the famine's cruelest twist was how it weaponized despair. Malnourished populations became breeding grounds for disease, with typhus and dysentery cutting down more people than any sword. Villages emptied, tax revenues evaporated, and the social order itself began to fray. When peasants couldn't feed their families, they stopped fearing kings or knights. Desperation made rebellion inevitable. The famine didn't just change military outcomes, It reshaped politics, economics, and even the feudal contract between lords and serfs. What makes this period so chilling is how familiar its lessons feel today. Modern armies rely on supply chains just as medieval ones did, and climate still holds the power to disrupt them. The Great Famine reminds us that war isn't just about courage or tactics, it's about whether soldiers have enough bread to keep fighting. When the rains came, they didn't just ruin crops, they exposed the fragile illusion of human control over destiny. Kingdoms that had weathered wars and plagues found themselves kneeling before an enemy they couldn't negotiate with, bribe, or outmaneuver, the relentless, indifferent sky. History's deadliest weapon wasn't forged in a blacksmith's furnace, it hatched in the fur of rodents, multiplied by a climate that refused to follow the rules. In the 1330s, a series of unusually warm, wet summers transformed the steppes of Central Asia into a breeding ground for disaster. The plague bacillus, which had lurked harmlessly in wild rodent populations for centuries, suddenly found its perfect accomplice, fleas thriving in the humidity, their numbers exploding as grasslands became soggy incubators. This wasn't just a seasonal shift, it was a meteorological betrayal, turning nature's balance into a death sentence for millions. When Mongol armies besieged the Genoese trading port of Kaffa in 1346, they brought more than siege engines to the battlements. Rats scurrying through their supply wagons carried infected fleas, and as corpses piled up outside the city walls, merchants fleeing in panic carried the plague onto ships bound for Europe. Trade winds that once brought silk and spices now delivered silent annihilation, with each bustling port, Constantinople, Messina, Marseille, becoming a new epicenter of despair. Military campaigns unwittingly became vectors of death, as soldiers marching from town to town spread the disease faster than any arrow volley. The horror lay in how climate and conquest collided. The same warm weather that had fueled the plague's birth in Asia now accelerated its spread through Europe, where a cooling period known as the Little Ice Age had already weakened harvests and starved populations. Malnourished bodies offered no resistance to the disease, and armies that should have been defending kingdoms found themselves burying their own in mass graves. The 100 Years' War between England and France ground to a surreal halt, not because of treaties or truces, but because there simply weren't enough living soldiers left to fight. What's often overlooked is how the plague reshaped warfare itself. Castles designed to withstand battering rams became death traps as crowded garrisons fed the contagion. The feudal system, built on peasant labor to support knightly elites, crumbled when half the workforce perished. Survivors demanded higher wages, undermining the economic foundations of medieval armies. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it killed an entire way of waging war. This wasn't just a pandemic, it was a climate-driven reckoning. The same monsoon rains that nourished crops one year could, with a slight shift, unleash apocalyptic consequences. When we study medieval battles, we focus on swords and shields, but the real game changer was something far smaller, a flea born of a wet summer that brought empires to their knees. The lesson echoes through centuries sometimes. The greatest threats don't march under banners, they ride the wind. Agincourt should have been a French victory by every conventional measure. Their army outnumbered Henry V's exhausted English forces by nearly 5-1, with hundreds of knights clad in the finest plate armor Europe could produce. But on October 25, 1415, conventional logic drowned in the mud. Weeks of unrelenting autumn rains had transformed the freshly plowed fields between the villages of Agincourt and Tramecourt into a sucking nightmare of churned earth. What should have been an open killing ground for French cavalry became a death trap, each hoofprint filling instantly with water, each step sinking deeper into the mire. The French charged anyway, their confidence unshaken. Their heavy war horses, bred to crash through infantry lines on firm ground, now floundered like ships in a storm. Knights who dismounted to press the attack found themselves immobilized, their steel armor designed to deflect arrows now dragging them down like anchors. English longbowmen, lightly clad and nimble, rained arrows from the edges of the swamp, their deadly volleys finding easy targets in the struggling mass. Men who had trained their whole lives for combat died not by sword strokes, but face down in the mud, suffocated under the weight of their own pride and technology. Henry's victory wasn't just tactical, it was meteorological. The same rains that ruined the French charge had also forced his army to march through days of misery, with dysentery thinning their ranks before the battle even began. Yet this adversity became their unlikely ally. While the French waited in comfort, their muscles stiff and their strategies rigid, the English adapted. They chose the battlefield, positioned their archers on firm ground flanked by dense woods, and turned the weather's cruelty into a weapon. What makes Agincourt so haunting is how it reveals the illusion of military superiority. The French had better armor, more knights, and the home advantage, but none of that mattered when the very earth revolted against them. This wasn't just a battle won by arrows, it was won by the inability of heavy cavalry to function in a world turned to soup. Modern historians still debate whether Henry was a genius or just lucky, but the truth lies in the mud itself. Climate didn't assist the English, it fought for them, rewriting the rules of engagement in ways no strategist could have predicted. The next time you hear about an unstoppable force, remember Agincourt's lesson. Sometimes the ground itself chooses the winner. Philip II of Spain had every reason to believe his armada was unstoppable. 130 ships, bristling with cannons and carrying 19,000 soldiers, formed the most formidable naval force Europe had ever seen. Their mission was clear: crush England's defiance, overthrow Elizabeth I, and restore Catholic supremacy. But the Spanish king made one fatal miscalculation. He planned for enemy fire, not the fury of the North Atlantic. As the Armada entered the English Channel in July 1588, the weather seemed almost cooperative at first. But then the winds shifted, not just once but repeatedly, as if nature itself had taken sides. English fireships' burning hulks set adrift forced the Spanish to scatter, but it was the gales that sealed their fate. A relentless storm system drove the massive galleons north, away from their planned rendezvous with invasion troops in Flanders. Without safe anchorages, the ships were pushed into the open ocean, where hurricane-force winds snapped masts like twigs and waves swallowed decks whole. The worst was yet to come. As the crippled fleet limped toward home by rounding Scotland and Ireland, another brutal storm struck. Ships that had survived battles now foundered on rocky coasts, their hulls smashed against cliffs as survivors who reached shore were often slaughtered by locals or succumbed to exposure. Of the original Armada, fewer than half the vessels made it back to Spain, and those that did were floating wrecks, their crews broken by starvation and disease. What's often forgotten is how much luck, or rather, the absence of it, played into this disaster. Spanish navigators were among the best of their age, but they lacked accurate long-term weather forecasting. The North Atlantic in late summer was a notorious gamble, and 1588 happened to be one of the stormiest seasons in living memory. Even the Armada's formation, perfect for Mediterranean warfare, proved disastrous in open ocean swells. The irony is exquisite. Spain's empire spanned continents, its wealth built on controlling the seas, yet its greatest naval campaign was undone by the very waters it claimed to master. This wasn't just a military defeat, it was a cosmic humiliation, proof that no amount of gold or piety could bend the weather to a king's will. The winds that scattered the Armada didn't just save England, they announced a new era where climate, not crowns, would decide who ruled the waves. When we picture the Spanish Armada, we should remember the real conqueror that year wasn't Elizabeth's navy, it was the storm. Kublai Khan's ambition stretched further than any Mongol ruler before him across the sea to Japan, a land that had stubbornly resisted his demands for submission. In 1274, he launched history's first full-scale naval invasion of the islands, commanding a combined fleet of 900 ships carrying nearly 40,000 Mongol, Chinese, and Korean warriors. This wasn't just an army, it was a floating city of conquest, equipped with siege engines and gunpowder bombs that had shattered empires on the mainland. The samurai defending Kyushu's beaches had never faced such overwhelming force. Then, without warning, the horizon darkened. The typhoon struck with apocalyptic fury, churning the strait between Korea and Japan into a maelstrom. Ships built for river warfare wide, flat-bottomed, and overloaded with men stood no chance against waves that snapped masts like kindling. Thousands drowned trapped below decks as vessels capsized, while those who washed ashore were cut down by samurai waiting in the storm's aftermath. Kublai's surviving forces limped home, but the Khan wasn't one to accept defeat. 7 years later, he returned with something even more terrifying. The largest pre-modern invasion fleet ever assembled, over 4,000 ships carrying nearly 140,000 troops. History rarely repeats itself so precisely. As this second armada massed in Hakata Bay in 1281, another typhoon roared out of the Pacific. This storm was worse. Legend speaks of waves tall as mountains and winds that plucked men from decks like autumn leaves. The Mongols' technological edge meant nothing here. Their prized gunpowder weapons dissolved in the rain, and their horses, panicked by the tempest, trampled soldiers in the holds. When dawn broke, the bay was a graveyard of splintered wood and bloated corpses. Less than half the fleet survived. What transformed these disasters into national mythology was Japan's interpretation. The ruling shoguns declared the typhoons kamikaze divine winds sent by the gods to protect the sacred islands. This wasn't just propaganda, it reshaped Japan's entire worldview, fostering a belief in supernatural favor that endured for centuries. The storms didn't merely repel invaders, they convinced a nation it was untouchable. Even in World War II, when Allied forces closed in, the term kamikaze would resurface as a last desperate echo of this medieval legend. Modern meteorology reveals a cruel irony. The Mongols likely timed their invasions for late summer, when seas were calmest, where this was peak typhoon season in the Western Pacific. Their fleets, designed for coastal operations, lacked the deep-hulled stability needed for open ocean survival. Climate didn't just intervene here, it exploited every tactical flaw with pinpoint precision. Kublai's failed invasions teach us something profound about history's turning points. Sometimes, the difference between conquest and collapse isn't strategy or strength, it's the unknowable rhythm of wind and water. Japan's salvation came not from swords, but from atmospheric currents that no ruler could command. The true legacy of the kamikaze isn't just shattered ships, it's the humbling reminder that nature writes the final draft of all human plans. The First Crusade was supposed to be God's war, a holy march to reclaim Jerusalem from infidel hands. But in the brutal summer of 1099, divine favor felt conspicuously absent as Frankish knights staggered through a landscape that seemed determined to kill them. The usual Mediterranean heat had twisted into something monstrous, a dry, searing furnace that cracked leather and turned metal armor into torture devices. What should have been a triumphant procession toward the holy city became a death march, with more Crusaders falling to thirst and heat stroke than to enemy arrows. These weren't inexperienced soldiers, they were hardened veterans who had survived the grueling trek across Europe and the bloody siege of Antioch. Yet nothing prepared them for the Palestinian summer's cruelty. Wells along the route, meticulously poisoned or filled in by retreating Fatimid forces, offered only dust. Horses collapsed first, their bodies bloating in the sun, forcing knights to abandon precious armor or risk cooking alive inside their own helmets. Chroniclers wrote of men gnawing on saddle leather for moisture, of priests blessing the dead with voices too parched to whisper prayers. Even the nights brought no relief as temperatures barely dropped, leaving the air thick and suffocating. When the Crusaders finally reached Jerusalem's walls in July, their victory was already bittersweet. The army that had set out with righteous fervor now resembled a ghostly procession, its ranks thinned not by Saracen swords but by an enemy no Crusader could strike, the sun itself. The siege that followed was less a battle of strategy than a desperate race against time without reliable water sources. The attackers knew they'd wither outside the city just as surely as the defenders would inside. What's often overlooked is how this climatic nightmare shaped the Crusaders' tactics and their psyche. The infamous brutality of Jerusalem's sack, where streets ran red with blood, wasn't just religious fanaticism. It was the eruption of months of bottled-up rage against an entire land that had tried to erase them. The very climate that nearly destroyed the Crusaders also forged them into something terrifying, a force so hardened by suffering that mercy felt like a luxury they couldn't afford. Modern climate studies reveal the cruel irony. 1099 fell within the medieval warm period, an era of elevated temperatures across Europe and the Near East. The Crusaders, expecting a climate like their homelands, marched into a weather system that was literally off the charts for their experience. Their armor, perfect for chilly European battles, became a death sentence under the Levantine sun. Even their logistical planning, based on European warfare, failed to account for desert warfare's unforgiving arithmetic. A man needs 4 times more water on the march than in camp, and a horse drinks enough daily to sustain 40 soldiers. This wasn't just a case of bad weather. It was a collision between two worlds, one where warfare followed predictable seasonal rhythms, and another where the environment itself was a silent, omnipotent foe. The Crusaders ultimately took Jerusalem not by overcoming the climate, but by enduring it at a cost so horrific it haunted them for generations. When we picture knights in shining armor, we should also see the truth. Those who survived weren't just conquerors. They were survivors of an invisible war waged by the sky itself, a war that left no visible scars but reshaped history in ways no chronicler could fully capture. England's King Edward II arrived at Bannockburn in June 1314 with every advantage: a professional army twice the size of Scotland's rebel forces, a fearsome contingent of armored knights, and the confidence that came from generations of military dominance. What he couldn't account for was the unseasonable deluge that had turned the Carse of Stirling into a quagmire. For days before the battle, relentless rains soaked the already marshy ground, transforming what should have been a cavalry paradise into a death trap of hidden streams and sucking peat bogs. The English vanguard, expecting to crush Robert the Bruce's spearmen with a single thunderous charge, instead found their war horses sinking belly deep into the mire, their momentum stolen by the very earth beneath them. Bruce had chosen this battlefield with chilling precision. While the English camped on the sodden lowlands, his forces occupied the drier high ground, their schiltron formations tight circles of pikemen anchored on terrain that gave them an almost inhuman stability. As English knights floundered, their heavy plate armor becoming a liability in the clinging mud, Scottish spears found easy targets in immobilized horses and riders struggling to regain footing. The famed longbowmen of England, usually decisive in open battle, found their arrows sinking harmlessly into the soft ground or bouncing off raised shields, their usual killing fields rendered useless by the terrain. What made Bannockburn so revolutionary wasn't just the weather's intervention, it was how Bruce weaponized it. He'd spent years perfecting guerrilla tactics in Scotland's bogs and glens, training his army to fight not as a traditional medieval force, but as an extension of the landscape itself. When the English cavalry charged, they weren't just fighting Scots, they were fighting the accumulated rainwater of a dozen storms, the hidden springs Bruce had deliberately left unblocked, and the very psychology of men who knew every inch of ground beneath their feet. The aftermath revealed the full scale of the disaster. English knights who escaped the spears often drowned in the River Forth, their armor dragging them under as they fled. Edward himself barely avoided capture, his royal banner abandoned in the mud, a humiliation that echoed across Europe. But the true significance lay deeper. Bannockburn proved that climate could democratize warfare, giving smaller, nimbler forces the power to negate technological and numerical superiority. The battle didn't just secure Scottish independence for a generation, it rewrote the rulebook on how terrain and weather could be harnessed as strategic weapons. Modern visitors to the site still feel the legacy of that rain-sodden June. The field's subtle dips and hollows, invisible until you're standing in them, explain why heavy cavalry failed so catastrophically. It's a reminder that the greatest generals don't just master tactics, they learn to listen to the land itself, to hear in the patter of rain and the crunch of soil 100 unspoken advantages. When we speak of Bruce's genius, we must also speak of the storms that were his silent allies, the mud that clung to English ambition and refused to let go. History remembers the bravery of the Scots, but the real hero of Bannockburn might have been the weather vane, spinning wildly in the wind, pointing toward an unexpected future. Suleiman the Magnificent's march toward Vienna in 1529 should have been the crowning moment of Ottoman expansion, a final thrust into the heart of Christendom that would rewrite the map of Europe. His army was the finest the Islamic world had ever assembled, 200,000 soldiers, 300 cannons, and a supply train stretching for miles. But the Sultan hadn't accounted for the Danube's autumn tantrums. Weeks of relentless rain turned the Hungarian plains into a liquid nightmare, bogging down his massive siege guns in mud so deep it swallowed entire wagons whole. What should have been a swift, overwhelming advance became a slog, with oxen dying of exhaustion as they strained to free artillery from the muck. Every day lost to the weather gave Vienna's defenders precious time to shore up crumbling walls and stockpile food. By the time the Ottomans finally reached the city in late September, the window of opportunity was already closing. Suleiman's engineers worked frantically to dig trenches for his bombards, but the sodden ground collapsed as fast as they could shovel. Cannonballs meant to shatter Vienna's fortifications instead sank harmlessly into waterlogged earth, their explosive impact muted. Then, as if nature itself had chosen sides, winter arrived early, a brutal onslaught of snow and ice that caught the Ottomans utterly unprepared. Their light summer tents offered no protection against the cold, and supply lines stretched dangerously thin across flooded rivers now frozen solid. Men who had conquered Rhodes and Belgrade found themselves defeated by something far more mundane: wet socks. Frostbite and dysentery ravaged the camp, while inside Vienna's walls, defenders huddled around fires fueled by Ottoman siege ladders. The retreat that followed was a humiliation etched in frozen mud. Abandoned cannons littered the road back to Constantinople, some so deeply mired they couldn't be salvaged. Suleiman, who had never before failed to take a city he besieged, would spend the rest of his life planning a second attempt, one that never came. Historians still debate what might have happened if those autumn rains had held off for just 3 more weeks. With functional artillery, Vienna's medieval walls would have crumbled, opening a path straight into Germany. The Ottoman Empire might have permanently altered Europe's religious and political landscape, but climate doesn't negotiate. The same rains that nourished Hungary's crops that year also starved Suleiman's war machine of its momentum. His story is a masterclass in how even the greatest military power can be undone by something as simple as bad timing. We remember the cannons and the cavalry, but the real deciding factor was the weather vane spinning wildly above Vienna, pointing not toward conquest, but toward an unseasonable frost that changed the course of history. The Abbasid Caliphate at its height was an empire of unimaginable wealth, its irrigation canals transforming the Tigris and Euphrates floodplains into agricultural wonderlands that fed millions. Baghdad stood as the world's intellectual capital, a glittering metropolis where scholars translated Greek philosophy and mathematicians charted the stars. But in the mid-9th century, the skies over Mesopotamia turned traitor. Rain clouds that had reliably nourished the land for generations vanished, leaving behind a creeping horror, a drought so prolonged it would make the very earth revolt against its rulers. What began as a few dry years soon spiraled into a 5-decade catastrophe. Canals that had watered wheat fields for centuries cracked under the sun, their beds filling with dust instead of water. Farmers who had once supplied grain to half the known world watched helplessly as their crops withered in the field, the soil itself lifting into the air in great suffocating clouds. Tax collectors, indifferent to the suffering, still demanded their quotas, stripping villages of what little food remained. And then, as hunger gnawed at the social order, something unprecedented happened. The peasants rose not just against their landlords, but against the Caliph himself. The Zanj rebellion of the late 9th century was no ordinary slave revolt. It was climate change weaponized. Thousands of enslaved laborers, many from East Africa, had been forced to work the salt flats of southern Iraq under brutal conditions. When the drought made their already miserable existence unbearable, they found an unlikely ally in the very land that oppressed them. The receding waters of the marshes provided perfect guerrilla terrain, a maze of dried-up channels where government forces couldn't pursue. Led by a charismatic rebel named Ali ibn Muhammad, the Zanj turned the Abbasid heartland into a war zone, sacking cities and burning estates with a fury born of decades of ecological despair. What makes this period so chilling is how it exposes the fragility of even the most sophisticated societies. The Abbasids had mastered architecture, astronomy, and bureaucracy, but they couldn't command the rain. As the drought persisted, the Caliphate's cohesion fractured. Provincial governors hoarded grain, nomadic tribes raided settled lands, and religious dissent spread like wildfire. The empire didn't fall overnight. It crumbled field by field, village by village, as the social contract between rulers and ruled dissolved in the heat. Modern soil studies tell a haunting story. Sediment cores from Iraqi marshes reveal layers of wind-blown dust dating precisely to this era, evidence of farmland turned to desert. Tree rings from Anatolia show stunted growth for 50 consecutive years, confirming contemporary accounts of withered orchards and starving livestock. This wasn't just bad luck, it was a climatic shift so severe it redefined the region's possibilities. The Abbasids would limp on for centuries, but their golden age ended when the rains did. There's a grim lesson here about the seeds of revolution. The Zanj rebels weren't just fighting masters, they were fighting an ecosystem that could no longer sustain life as before. When the land itself becomes an adversary, no army, no matter how well trained or well funded, can maintain control indefinitely. The Abbasid drought reminds us that civilizations aren't defeated by swords alone, but by the slow, inexorable withdrawal of nature's cooperation. The next time you walk past a flourishing field, consider this. Every empire is just a few dry seasons away from becoming dust. Genghis Khan's conquests reshaped continents, but few realize his greatest ally wasn't his cavalry, it was the weather. In the late 12th century, the Mongolian steppes experienced something extraordinary. Decades of unusually heavy rains that transformed the arid grasslands into an ocean of waist-high forage. For nomadic herders, this was like stumbling upon a gold mine. Each additional inch of rainfall meant more grass, which meant more horses, which meant more warriors fed and mobile across distances that would cripple other armies. While European kings struggled to feed their troops beyond a few weeks' march, the Mongols carried their pantry with them, living off mare's milk and dried meat from herds that moved with the army, a self-sustaining system perfected by climate's generosity. The numbers tell the story. A single Mongol warrior needed up to 10 horses in rotation, allowing him to cover nearly 100 miles a day without exhausting any single mount. This staggering mobility wasn't just training or tradition, it was ecology in action. The wetter climate produced enough vegetation to sustain these vast herds, turning what had been a survival challenge into a strategic superpower. When Genghis unified the tribes in 1206, he wasn't just commanding men, he was harnessing an entire ecosystem supercharged by ideal conditions. But here's the twist. The Mongols didn't just benefit from the weather, they weaponized it. Their entire military doctrine relied on understanding seasonal grass growth patterns. Campaigns were timed to coincide with peak pasture availability, ensuring their horses remained strong deep into enemy territory. During the invasion of Khwarezmia, they deliberately lured Persian armies into the steppes in late summer, where the dry season grass had already been consumed by Mongol herds. The enemy's horses starved while Genghis's forces thrived, their supply lines literally growing beneath their feet. Modern climate studies reveal how precise their advantage was. Ice cores from the Altai Mountains show elevated moisture levels from 1180 to 1250, exactly the window of Mongol expansion. Tree rings from Siberian pines confirm these were the lushest centuries in a millennium. The empire didn't just rise because of brilliant leadership, it exploded across Eurasia because the climate handed it the perfect toolkit, endless grasslands fueling endless mobility. When the rains eventually retreated in the late 13th century, so too did the Mongols' unstoppable momentum, their vast federation fracturing as the steppes returned to their drier norm. What's haunting is how quietly this lesson echoes today. The Mongols built history's largest contiguous land empire not by defying nature but by riding its coattails. Their story reminds us that even the most fearsome conquerors are ultimately at the mercy of the skies, and that sometimes the difference between obscurity and world domination is just a few extra inches of rain. The Hansitic League didn't just dominate Baltic trade, they built an empire on ice. For centuries, their merchant networks thrived by mastering one simple truth: winter was their highway. When the Baltic froze solid, heavy goods like timber, grain, and salt could glide across sled routes faster and cheaper than any ship could sail. But in the late 14th century, the rhythm of the seasons began to stutter. Winters grew unpredictable, with some years bringing barely any ice at all, while others unleashed frost so sudden they trapped ships in harbors mid-unload. The League's entire business model, a delicate ballet of storage, transport, and timing, depended on nature's consistency, and nature had stopped cooperating. Take the Great Freeze of 1386, when an early cold snap locked the Vistula River in October, months ahead of schedule. Hansitic warehouses in Danzig were still half full of autumn grain shipments, waiting for the usual December freeze to begin sled exports. Instead, the ice came early, then thawed abruptly in November, leaving merchants scrambling to move goods over muddy, impassable roads. Rivals from Holland, whose deep-hulled ships could navigate icy waters more reliably, swooped in to claim contracts the Hansitic traders couldn't fulfill. It was a pattern that repeated across decades. Delayed frosts meant missed deliveries, while sudden thaws stranded sleds mid-route, their precious cargoes rotting under unexpected rain. What makes this collapse so fascinating is how it exposes the fragility of even the most sophisticated pre-modern economies. The League had treaties, tariffs, and trade laws fine-tuned over generations, but none of that mattered when the ice roads vanished. Their legendary contour trading posts from London to Novgorod became white elephants, their carefully stocked inventories stuck in place. Even their famed cog ships, designed for Baltic conditions, couldn't adapt to the new reality of erratic storms and shifting currents. The cruelest twist, the League's decline coincided with the dawn of the Little Ice Age, a period we now associate with extreme cold. But climate change is rarely uniform. While some regions froze harder, others experienced destabilizing volatility. The Baltic's once reliable freeze-thaw cycles became a gamble, and the Hansitic merchants were the ones paying the price. By the mid-15th century, Dutch and English traders had overtaken them, not through superior strategy, but simply because their shipping technologies could weather the unpredictability. There's a profound lesson here about how civilizations rise and fall on environmental stability. The Hanseatic League didn't lose to a rival or a war. They lost to a handful of degrees shift in average temperatures, a change so small no merchant could see it coming, yet large enough to melt the foundations of an empire. The next time you hear about supply chain disruptions, remember the medieval traders who learned the hard way. No amount of wealth or ingenuity can outmaneuver a climate that won't hold still. The Tang dynasty in the mid-8th century wasn't just powerful, it was the brightest civilization on Earth, a golden age of poetry and prosperity stretching from the Silk Road to the Korean frontier. But in 755, everything unraveled with terrifying speed, not because of an invading army or a corrupt emperor, but because the sky turned against them. Months of unseasonable cold had gripped northern China, withering crops and freezing rivers that should have been bustling trade routes. Farmers who couldn't pay taxes abandoned their fields, while soldiers stationed along the restless frontier grew hungry and resentful. Then in December, General Lushan raised his rebellion banner, and what followed would become the deadliest conflict in human history until World War II. Modern science has uncovered the smoking gun behind this disaster. Ice cores from Greenland reveal layers of sulfate deposits dating to 753, the fingerprint of a colossal volcanic eruption, likely in Indonesia. When volcanoes spew ash into the stratosphere, they create a sun-blocking veil that chills the planet for years. For Tang China, this meant summer frosts killing rice seedlings and winter blizzards burying granaries. Starvation spread like wildfire, and in Lushan's rebel army, many of the malnourished border troops found eager recruits among peasants who had nothing left to lose. The rebellion's brutality was matched only by its irony. Both the Tang loyalists and Lushan's forces were professional soldiers of the same empire, trained in the same tactics, often speaking the same dialects. But hunger erased old loyalties. Contemporary accounts describe cannibalism in besieged cities, soldiers boiling corpses for broth, and refugees eating tree bark until their stomachs burst. The chaos reached surreal levels when Lushan himself was assassinated by his own son, who then faced rebellion from his father's former generals. This wasn't just war, it was societal collapse accelerated by climate's cruel whims. What's often overlooked is how the weather prolonged the suffering. Normally, civil wars burn out quickly when one side gains momentum, but the volcanic winters dragged on for nearly a decade. Just as one faction seemed poised for victory, another crop failure would destabilize their supply lines, resetting the conflict. The Tang capital of Chang'an changed hands 7 times, its once majestic canals filled with corpses instead of merchant barges. By the time the rebellion finally sputtered out in 763, 2/3 of China's tax-paying households had vanished, either dead, displaced, or beyond government control. The aftermath reveals climate's lasting scars. The Tang dynasty technically survived, but its golden age was over. The empire fractured into semi-independent provinces, its cosmopolitan confidence replaced by suspicion and isolation. Poetry from the era reflects this trauma, where once verses celebrated cherry blossoms and moonlit banquets, now they mourned abandoned villages and skeletal children. Even more telling, the rebellion's death toll, estimated at 13 to 36 million, exceeded the entire population of medieval Europe. There's a chilling modern parallel here. Like the Tang, we assume our institutions and technologies make us immune to nature's moods. But the An Lushan rebellion proves that when climate stress meets social tension, even the most advanced societies can implode with shocking speed. The next time you hear about a volcanic eruption or a failed harvest halfway across the world, remember, history's darkest chapters often begin not with a bang, but with a long, silent winter. Charles the Bold of Burgundy fancied himself a second Caesar, his army a gleaming testament to Renaissance warfare's cutting edge. Swiss mercenaries had crushed his dreams once before at Grandson, but now, in the bitter January of 1476, revenge was within reach. His artillery train, state-of-the-art bombards hauled by the finest draft horses, would reduce those alpine upstarts to rubble. Then winter laughed, and the laughter was a blizzard. The snow came not in flurries, but in great suffocating waves, swallowing roads whole and burying supply wagons up to their axles. Burgundian gunners, their brass cannons gleaming uselessly under ice, soon discovered a horrifying truth: steel conducts cold. Men who touched their frozen weapons without gloves left skin behind. Horses, their nostrils crusted with ice, collapsed mid-step, taking precious guns with them. And still Charles pressed forward, his arrogance outstripping even the storm's fury. What happened next was less a battle than a slow-motion massacre. Swiss skirmishers, clad in layered wool and moving like ghosts through the blizzard, picked off Burgundian sentries who could barely see 10 paces. When Charles finally ordered a retreat, his army found the escape routes choked with snowdrifts taller than a man. The chronicles tell of knights frozen upright in their saddles, their last moments preserved in grotesque ice sculptures. Others, desperate for warmth, hacked apart their own wagons for firewood, only to watch the green timber smolder uselessly in the damp wind. The irony cuts deep. Burgundy's wealth had bought the finest plate armor in Christendom, but that very technology became a death sentence. While Swiss fighters wrapped themselves in furs and kept moving, Burgundian knights sat immobilized, their articulated joints frozen solid, their visors sealed shut by ice. Even Charles's famed Black Band, an elite guard sworn to die for him, perished without drawing swords, their bodies locked in rigor mortis before they hit the ground. Modern reconstructions reveal the physics behind this horror. At -20 degrees Celsius, steel loses nearly all flexibility. A gauntlet that bends easily in summer might shatter like glass under a winter mace blow. The Burgundians weren't just defeated, they were betrayed by the very innovation that should have guaranteed their dominance, but the true tragedy lies in the aftermath. Charles, humiliated but still defiant, would launch one more ill-fated campaign before meeting his end at Nancy. His frozen legions, however, never recovered. The men who survived Morat weren't just broken in body, They were shattered in spirit, having learned the hard way that no amount of gold or gunpowder can bribe the wind. The Swiss, meanwhile, cemented their reputation as masters of winter warfare, a lesson Europe's kings would grudgingly respect for centuries. There's a reason mountain folk have always distrusted outsiders with their fancy gadgets. The Burgundian catastrophe wasn't just a bad day on the battlefield. It was nature's decree that some forces refused to be tamed. Next time you complain about a snow delay, remember Charles the Bold. His parade of progress ended in a ditch, preserved for eternity by the oldest general of all winter. The summer of 1212 should have been the end of Christian Spain. The Almohad Caliphate had crossed the straits from Africa with the largest Muslim army seen in generations, 60,000 strong, their ranks filled with hardened Berber warriors and Arab cavalry that had dominated Iberia for centuries. King Alfonso VIII of Castile gathered his outnumbered forces at Los Navas de Tolosa, knowing this was likely his last stand. Then, as dawn broke on July 16th, the sky answered his prayers with something no tactician could have predicted, a deluge so violent it seemed biblical. For the Christian camp perched on high ground, the rain was a miracle. Parched soldiers caught the downpour in helmets and shields, their dry throats finally soothed after days of rationing. Horses, near collapse from thirst, drank from newly formed streams rushing between the rocks. But downhill, where the Almohads had pitched their lavish tents in the valley, the storm revealed its cruel duality. The same rain that saved their enemies became a weapon against them. Flash floods tore through their encampment, sweeping away food stores, drowning pack animals, and turning the ground beneath their famed black pavilions into a churning bog. What followed was less a battle than a slow unraveling. The Almohad army, its cohesion shattered by the storm's chaos, struggled to form battle lines in the mud. Their elite cavalry, usually unstoppable on firm ground, now floundered, horses slipping, lances dipping uselessly into the mire. Meanwhile, the refreshed Christian troops charged downhill with terrifying momentum, their footing secure on slopes that had channeled the rainwater away. Chroniclers would later describe the Muslim ranks melting like salt in the rain, their discipline dissolving as panic spread. The real tragedy lies in the strategic miscalculation no one could have foreseen. The Almohads had chosen their camp precisely because the valley offered ample space and nearby springs perfect conditions for any normal summer day. But climate anomalies from the medieval warm period had made Iberian weather increasingly erratic. That July storm wasn't just bad luck. It was part of a larger pattern of extreme rainfall events that would reshape the peninsula's destiny. Los Navas de Tolosa didn't just break Almohad power, it shattered the myth of their invincibility. Within decades, Muslim territories would shrink to Granada's mountain redoubt, while Christian kingdoms surged forward with newfound confidence. The irony. Both sides claimed divine favor that day. The Christians saw God's hand in the storm, while Muslim poets later wrote of the rain as a test of faith. But modern meteorology suggests a simpler truth. Sometimes victory doesn't go to the righteous or the strong, it goes to whoever packed for the weather. The Teutonic Knights had spent decades carving out their Baltic Crusader state with fire and sword, their heavy cavalry unstoppable on solid ground. But in April 1242, the frozen surface of Lake Peipus became their downfall, not by accident, but by Alexander Nevsky's brilliant exploitation of nature's calendar. The Germans assumed the ice would hold. After all, winter's grip on Russia was legendary. What they didn't account for was the cunning of a prince who knew his homeland's rhythms better than any foreign invader. Nevsky's strategy was simple yet devastating. He drew the Crusader forces clad in their signature white mantles and full-plate armor onto the lake's thinning surface, feigning retreat until the weight of their own arrogance became literal. As the German knights charged, the ice groaned under their combined mass, their horses' hooves finding less solid purchase with each stride. Then, with a sound like thunder, the frozen sheet fractured, swallowing men and steeds alike into the black water below. Those who didn't drown immediately faced a grimmer fate, the merciless cold sapping their strength as they struggled in water that numbed limbs within minutes. What makes this moment so chilling is the precision of Nevsky's timing. April in the Baltic is a transitional season, when daytime warmth softens ice just enough to betray the unwary, while nighttime refreezing hides the danger until it's too late. Contemporary chronicles describe Crusaders attempting to flee across the cracking surface, only to slide helplessly back toward Russian spearmen waiting on the secure shoreline. The lake didn't just assist Nevsky's victory, it became his executioner, its icy jaws snapping shut on an entire military order's ambition. Modern climate reconstructions reveal the deeper irony. The 13th century marked the beginning of the Little Ice Age, a period of erratic temperature swings that made frozen waterways unpredictable. The Teutonic Knights, accustomed to Germany's more stable winters, had no framework for this volatility. Their armor, designed to deflect swords, became a death sentence when submerged, dragging them under like stones. Meanwhile, Nevsky's lighter-clad warriors, many wearing felt boots and layered furs, could scramble to safety where the Germans floundered. The battle's aftermath reshaped Eastern Europe. The Teutonic Order never fully recovered its momentum, its reputation for invincibility shattered along with the ice. Nevsky, canonized as a Russian saint, became legend not just for his tactics, but for his intimate understanding of the land itself. There's a reason this clash endures in cultural memory. It wasn't just a victory of men, but of place. The next time you see a frozen pond, remember, beneath that serene surface lies the same elemental power that once decided the fate of empires. The 100 Years' War wasn't just fought on battlefields, it was waged against the elements themselves, with weather patterns holding more power than any king's decree. Take Edward III's devastating Chevauchée campaign of 1359, where 60,000 English soldiers marched across France burning crops and villages. This strategy of economic warfare should have crippled French resistance until the heavens opened in ways no commander could counter. Weeks of torrential rain turned the countryside into a quagmire, rotting the spoils they'd come to plunder and transforming supply routes into impassable swamps. Horses sank to their withers in mud, wagons were abandoned by the hundreds, and dysentery spread through waterlogged camps like wildfire. What began as a show of strength became a desperate retreat, with soldiers reportedly trading armor for dry bread as they limped back to Calais. Then there were the sieges that climate stole. The English blockade of Rheims in 1360 lasted just 3 weeks, not because walls were breached, but because an unseasonable heatwave baked the surrounding fields into dust. Wells ran dry, food spoiled within hours, and the stench of dead horses drew swarms of flies that tormented men already weakened by thirst. Contemporary accounts describe knights fainting in their armor under the July sun, their expensive plate mail transformed into personal ovens. The French, safely behind their walls with deeper cisterns, simply watched as their enemies withered away without a single arrow being loosed. But the most dramatic weather intervention came at Agincourt in 1415, where French confidence literally drowned in the mud. Their heavily armored cavalry, the pride of medieval Europe, became trapped in freshly plowed fields saturated by autumn rains. Horses that should have smashed through English lines instead sank belly deep, their riders helpless targets for Henry V's longbowmen. The same downpour that ruined French armor polish a point of aristocratic pride saved English arrows from rust, keeping their deadly volleys coming. Nature didn't just influence this battle, it picked sides with meteorological precision. What makes these climate twists so fascinating is how they expose the fragility of medieval warfare's logistics. A single storm could erase months of planning, while a week of sunshine might save a kingdom. Commanders who understood this, like Henry V, who timed his campaigns around harvest seasons, gained an edge no amount of knights could match. The true victors of the 100 Years' War weren't just those with better armies, but those who learned to read the skies like farmers read the soil. In an era before weather forecasts, the difference between triumph and disaster often came down to who noticed the clouds gathering first. These climate-driven battles aren't just ancient footnotes, they're urgent case studies in survival. What unites the Vikings starving in Greenland and the Burgundians freezing at Morat is a fatal assumption that the environment would always cooperate. Medieval societies built entire military doctrines around predictable seasons, stable coastlines, and reliable harvests. When those patterns shifted, even the mightiest empires found their spears useless against a changing sky. Consider the parallels to our modern world. Like the Abbasid caliphs ignoring decades of drought until their canals ran dry, we've designed cities and supply chains assuming yesterday's weather will hold forever. The Mongols thrived when the steppes bloomed, but their empire fractured when the rains retreated, just as today's economies shudder when once reliable growing zones wither. History's clearest lesson isn't about weapons or walls, it's about flexibility. The societies that endured, whether Swiss mountaineers leveraging winter or Japanese coastal watchers anticipating typhoons, weren't the strongest or richest. They were the most attentive, the ones who treated climate not as a backdrop, but as the central character in every campaign. This isn't just about preparing for disasters. It's about recognizing how subtly climate reshapes human conflict. The Black Death didn't just kill millions, it shattered feudalism by giving surviving laborers bargaining power. The Hansitic League's collapse wasn't merely economic, it shifted Baltic dominance to nations with adaptable ships. Even small changes accumulate. A single early thaw that saved Vienna from the Ottomans, or one volcanic winter that doomed the Tang dynasty. Modern strategists take note. Today's drought-driven migrations and melting Arctic trade routes are already rewriting alliances and sparking new tensions. Perhaps the most haunting insight lies in what these stories don't say. Nowhere will you find a medieval chronicle blaming climate change. They lacked that concept. Leaders attributed famine to divine wrath or bad luck, never suspecting the larger patterns. We have no such excuse. Ice cores, tree rings, and satellite data reveal the rhythms they could only suffer. Their ignorance cost civilizations. Ours would be unforgivable. The past offers no perfect blueprint. No medieval society faced carbon dioxide levels like ours. But it does provide perspective. When the Burgundians' armor froze, it wasn't just metal failing, it was the illusion of human supremacy over nature. As we engineer flood barriers and drought-resistant crops, we do well to remember, adaptation isn't about conquering the environment, but learning to dance with its ever-changing tempo. The true test of any civilization isn't how it fights on sunny days, but whether it can read the gathering storm. From frozen lakes to fevered winds, climate has been the unseen general directing history's turning points. These 20 moments reveal a truth we often overlook, that the fate of empires and the rise of nations hinge not just on swords and strategy, but on the silent, relentless force of the natural world. The Vikings didn't abandon Greenland because they grew weak. They left because the ice refused to retreat. The Mongols didn't halt at Vienna because they lost their nerve. They turned back because the Danube thawed too soon. Time and again, the weather vane proved mightier than the banner. What's humbling is how these stories mirror our own precarious dance with climate today. Medieval kings couldn't predict droughts or tame storms, but they understood one thing. Survival meant adapting to nature's whims, not defying them. The Swiss won at Morat because they dressed for the blizzard, while the Burgundians froze in their glittering armor. The Hansitic League crumbled not because their merchants grew lazy, but because their business model assumed the Baltic would always freeze on schedule. The lesson: resilience isn't about strength alone. It's about flexibility, about reading the clouds as carefully as the enemy's formation. Now consider our modern battlefield. Rising seas threaten naval bases, wildfires scorch training grounds, and droughts ignite conflicts over shrinking resources. The Pentagon already calls climate change a threat multiplier, echoing the chaos that toppled the Abbasids or starved Edward II's army. But there's hope in history's whispers. The societies that endured, like the Japanese who turned typhoons into cultural shields, or the Mongols who rode the wet steppes to glory, were the ones who listened to the land. They didn't conquer nature, they partnered with it. So as you step away from these stories, ask yourself, who are we in this ancient drama? The generals charging heedless into the storm, or the scouts who notice the wind shifting? The choice is ours, and the stakes are higher than ever. Drop a comment below with the climate-driven battle that haunts you most. Was it the mud of Agincourt, the ice of Lake Peipus, or something else entirely? Let's keep unraveling history's wildest, most unpredictable co-author, the weather. And if you're hungry for more tales where nature steals the spotlight, hit that subscribe button. The forecast: plenty more surprises